Visualize the scene. A man wakes up in the middle of the night, his body burning with fever. His skin is so hot that his wife, lying beside him on a straw mat on the packed earth floor, feels the heat radiating without even needing to touch him. He trembles. He shakes so violently that the sound of his teeth chattering echoes in that windowless room of rough stone walls. And what does he do? He does not call a doctor. He does not take medicine. He does not go to a hospital. He stands up, walks to the door of the house, and goes to find a priest, because 2,000 years ago, getting sick was not a medical problem, it was a spiritual problem. Disease did not come from a virus, a bacteria, or contaminated water. Disease came from God. And if God sent the disease, only God could take it away. But here is the question that almost no one asks. How did millions of people survive in a world where fever, infection, and pain had no name, had no known cause, and the only treatment available was prayer and animal sacrifice? The answer is more surprising and more brutal than you imagine. To understand what it meant to fall ill in Bible times, you must first erase everything you know about medicine. Everything. Forget antibiotics, forget anesthesia, forget x-rays, forget the idea that a disease has a biological cause that can be identified and treated. Now imagine this. You live in a village in Judea around the year 0. Your house has 2 rooms. The floor is made of compacted earth. You share the space with your family of 6, and at night with the household animals, goats, sheep, sometimes a donkey. The roof is made of wooden beams covered with a mixture of mud and straw that needs to be redone every rainy season. There is no plumbing. There is no sewage system. Water comes from a public cistern that collects rain and where animals occasionally fall and die, contaminating everything. Trash is thrown into the street. Manure accumulates in the corners. And the smell is something a modern person could not endure for more than 5 minutes. This is the setting where disease thrived, and it thrived with a ferocity that is difficult to comprehend today. Historians estimate that the average life expectancy in first century Palestine was 35 years. 35. This does not mean that people died at 35 and that was it. It means that infant mortality was so devastating, about 30% of children died before completing 1 year of life, and nearly half did not reach the age of 10, that it pulled the average down brutally. If you survived childhood, you might live to 50 or 60. But surviving childhood was the hard part. And here enters the first detail that will change the way you read any biblical story involving children. When Jesus raises Jairus' daughter, a 12-year-old girl, or when he heals the son of a Roman official, these were not stories about abstract miracles. They were stories about parents living the most common nightmare of that era, watching a child die and being able to do absolutely nothing. But what exactly killed these people? The list is long, and each item on it is more terrifying than the last. Malaria, tuberculosis, dysentery, leprosy, parasitic infections of all kinds, typhoid fever, cholera, eye infections that led to permanent blindness. Something so common in the region that the Old Testament mentions blindness dozens of times as one of the greatest known afflictions. And here is the cruel detail. Most of these diseases had simple cures. Clean water would solve half of them. Basic hand hygiene would eliminate another large portion. A common antibiotic, the kind you buy at any pharmacy for a few dollars today, would have saved millions of lives. But no one knew that. No one even suspected it. The idea that invisible creatures lived in the water, in the air, and in the dirt and could invade the human body. This idea would only be taken seriously 2,000 years later, with Louis Pasteur and germ theory. Throughout the entire biblical period, humanity fought against an army of enemies they could not see, could not name, and could not understand. And it is exactly here that something fascinating enters. Because even without a microscope, without a laboratory, without any scientific theory about diseases, the Bible contains a set of health rules that, when you look at them through the eyes of modern medicine, are startlingly advanced. And most people have no idea. Let's go to the book of Leviticus. Leviticus is that book that most people skip because it seems like an endless list of strange rules about what to eat, what to wear, what to touch, when to wash. It seems tedious. It seems irrelevant. But when modern doctors and epidemiologists analyze these laws, they find something that defies explanation. Leviticus 13, for example, describes with almost clinical precision what to do when a person presents a skin lesion. The text says, and I am paraphrasing, that the person must be taken to the priest. The priest examines the lesion. If the lesion is deeper than the surrounding skin and the hair in the area has turned white, the person is declared unclean. And here comes the crucial part. They are isolated, separated from the community for 7 days. After 7 days, the priest examines them again. If the lesion has spread, the isolation continues. If it has not spread, the person washes their clothes and is considered clean. Did you notice what you just heard? That is quarantine, sanitary isolation with a period of observation and clinical reassessment. 3,500 years before the World Health Organization existed, the biblical text already described the fundamental principle of contagious disease control, isolating the sick to protect the community. And it was not a random isolation. The 7-day period corresponds to the incubation time of various skin diseases. The observation of the progression of the lesions, whether they spread or not, is exactly the criterion a dermatologist would use today to differentiate a contagious infection from a benign irritation. If this surprised you as much as it surprised me while researching, comment, "I didn't know." But Leviticus does not stop there. Chapter 15 deals with bodily fluids and establishes that anyone who touched someone with an abnormal discharge should wash their hands with running water. Running water, not stagnant water in a basin. Running water. Do you know when modern medicine discovered that washing hands with running water was essential to prevent infections? In 1847. A Hungarian doctor named Ignác Semmelweis noticed that doctors who washed their hands between handling cadavers and performing deliveries had dramatically lower mortality rates. He was ridiculed. They called him crazy. He died committed to an asylum, and the rule he discovered had already been written in Leviticus for over 3,000 years. Numbers 19 commands that anyone who touched a corpse would be unclean for 7 days and should purify themselves with a mixture of water and ashes from a red heifer. For centuries, theologians treated this as pure religious ritual, until modern medicine demonstrated that decomposing corpses are devastating sources of bacteria, and that the ashes, due to their alkaline content, work as a primitive disinfectant agent. Deuteronomy 23 commands that the Israelites designate a place outside the camp for their physiological needs, and that they use a stake to bury the waste. Basic sanitation, waste management, separation between the living area and the waste area. While entire civilizations around them, Egyptians, Babylonians, Canaanites, lived literally on top of their own waste, the Israelites had a direct order to keep excrement away from the camp, covered with earth. Now, and here I need to be honest with you, there is a huge debate among academics about how to interpret all of this. One school of thought argues that these laws were simply religious purity rituals. The concept of clean and unclean in Leviticus is not hygienic, it is ceremonial. It has to do with holiness before God, not with germs. The other school argues that, regardless of the original intention, the practical effect of these laws was unequivocally sanitary. and the truth probably lies at the intersection of the two. What is undeniable, and historians of all stripes agree on this, is that during the Great Plague outbreaks in medieval Europe, Jewish communities that followed these Levitical laws had significantly lower mortality rates than the surrounding populations. So much lower, in fact, that they were accused of poisoning the wells of the Christians. Because it was impossible that they were dying less. The real explanation: they washed their hands, they isolated the sick, they buried waste, and they boiled water. All because a book written millennia before commanded it. But knowing the rules and having a cure are completely different things. And here we enter the hardest part of this story. Because when disease actually arrived, and it always arrived, the suffering was of an intensity that the modern world has simply erased from memory. Think about this. You have a tooth infection. Today, you go to the dentist, get anesthesia, the problem is resolved in 30 minutes, and you go home with an anti-inflammatory. 2,000 years ago, that same infection could kill you, and it didn't kill you fast. The infection started in the tooth, spread to the gums, descended into the jaw, and reached skull bones. Without antibiotics to stop it, the bacteria entered the bloodstream. Septicemia, uncontrollable fever, delirium, and a slow death, which could take weeks, caused by a problem that today costs $20 to solve. Skulls found in archaeological excavations in the Jerusalem region showed dental abscesses so advanced that the surrounding bone literally dissolved. Can you imagine the pain? Weeks of uninterrupted pain, without painkillers, without anyone who could explain to you what was happening inside your own head. And the tooth was the least of the problems. Fractures were an almost certain sentence, not of death necessarily, but of permanent disability. If you broke a leg, falling from a wall, stepping in a hole on the path, being hit by a cart, there was no orthopedic surgeon to realign the bone. What existed was a brutal method. Someone held the leg while another person pulled the bone in the correct direction, without anesthesia, without x-rays to check the alignment, without a cast. They tied wooden splints with strips of cloth and hoped the bone would fuse in the right place. Frequently it did not. Skeletons unearthed in Qumran, the same community of the Dead Sea Scrolls, show bones that fused crookedly, shortening legs, deforming arms, condemning people to a lifetime of pain and limitation because of an accident that lasted 2 seconds. But what truly separated the ancient world from the modern world was not the lack of treatment, it was the lack of diagnosis. Today, when you get sick, the first thing a doctor does is find out what you have. Fever, let's measure it. Chest pain, let's do an EKG. Persistent cough, let's take a chest x-ray. Diagnosis is the starting point of any treatment. But in the biblical world, diagnosis as a medical concept did not exist. The question was not, what do you have? The question was, what did you do? Disease was understood almost universally as a consequence of sin. Did you go blind? Someone sinned, you or your parents. Do you have leprosy? God is punishing you. Was your child born with a deformity? There is hidden sin in your family. This was not a peripheral, obscure belief of a radical sect. It was the dominant cultural consensus. So dominant that Jesus' own disciples, people who lived with him daily, carried this mentality. In the Gospel of John, chapter 9, the disciples see a man blind from birth and ask the question that defines an entire era of medicine. Master, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Do you notice the structure of the question? They don't ask if someone sinned. They ask who sinned. Guilt is presupposed. The disease has to be a punishment. The only question is identifying the culprit. And Jesus' answer destroys this entire logic. Neither this man nor his parents sinned. 6 words that demolished centuries of medical theology. Except that this answer from Jesus was the radical exception, not the rule. In daily practice, The sick person carried not only the weight of the disease, but the weight of guilt. And this created a layer of suffering that was perhaps worse than the infirmity itself. Because if disease is divine punishment, then the sick person is guilty. If the sick person is guilty, they are unclean. If they are unclean, they are dangerous, spiritually contagious. And if they are spiritually contagious, they need to be removed, isolated, expelled. If you believe that God never abandons his own, comment, God is faithful. And no disease illustrates this cycle of horror with more cruelty than leprosy. The word leprosy in the Bible, in Hebrew tzara'at, probably did not refer only to Hansen's disease as we know it today. It covered a spectrum of skin diseases, psoriasis, vitiligo, severe eczema, fungal infections, perhaps even chronic dermatitis. But the social treatment was the same for all of them. Leviticus 13:45-46 describes the sentence with a coldness that chills the blood. The leper who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. Torn clothes, disheveled hair, covered face, and the obligation to shout his own condition to anyone who approached. Unclean, unclean, imagine that. Imagine being forced to announce your disease out loud to every person who crossed your path so they could move away from you in time. You were no longer a person. You were a walking danger, a threat to the purity of the community. And your home was no longer inside the city, among your family, your friends, your life. Your home was now outside the walls, alone. Or with other lepers, forming small colonies of outcasts on the outskirts of cities, groups of people whom society treated as the living dead. The Talmud, the compilation of Jewish oral tradition, lists leprosy as one of the 4 conditions equivalent to death, not like death. Equivalent to death. Being diagnosed with leprosy was like dying socially. Your wife could ask for a divorce. Your children were placed in the custody of others. Your assets were redistributed. And if you dared to enter the city, they could stone you, not as a criminal punishment, but as a community defense. In the same way, they would kill a rabid animal that entered the gates. And here is the detail that makes all of this even more devastating. Many of these people had nothing contagious. A man with severe psoriasis, an autoimmune disease that does not pass from person to person in any way, was subjected to the same social exile as someone with a real bacterial infection. There was no way to distinguish. There was no way to test. The skin was lesioned. The priest declared it unclean, and it was over. Your life was over, not because the disease was going to kill you, but because society decided you were already dead. And here enters a twist that completely changes this story. Because in the midst of this brutal system of exclusion, a man arises who does something no one else did, that no one dared to do, that in the mentality of the time was more shocking than any miracle of healing. In Matthew 8, a leper approaches Jesus. This, in itself, is already a grave violation. The leper should have shouted unclean and moved away. But he approaches, and what does Jesus do? The text says Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. He touched him. He didn't speak from distance. He didn't tell him to wash in the river. He didn't say, "Go find a priest." He reached out his hand and touched the lesioned skin of a man whom no person had touched for months, perhaps years. In a world where touch made the one who touched unclean, Jesus touched. And instead of him becoming unclean by the contact, the reverse happened. The uncleanness left the leper. Purity flowed in the opposite direction. This gesture, the touch, is easy to underestimate reading it 2,000 years later. But place yourself in that scene. The smell of decomposing skin, the open lesions, the horrified looks of the crowd around, and a rabbi reaching out his hand to touch what everyone considered untouchable. Even before the physical healing, something happened that was perhaps more powerful: the healing of dignity. That man became human again the instant another hand touched his. But Jesus' touch of the lepers was the absolute exception. For the other millions of sick people scattered throughout Palestine, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, what remained? What kind of medicine existed when there were no real doctors? The answer involves crushed plants, olive oil, rituals with pigeon blood, and a relationship with pain that the modern world can no longer understand. Let's talk about what passed for medicine in the ancient world. Because medicine existed, it just wasn't anything like what the word means today. The main medicinal resource of first-century Palestine was olive oil. Olive oil was to the biblical world what aspirin is to the modern world. It served for everything. Muscle pain, olive oil. Open wound, olive oil. Fever, olive oil. Rubbed over the entire body, earache. Warm olive oil dripped into the ear canal. Dry, cracked skin bleeding from the desert sun, olive oil. And here is what is fascinating. Modern science has confirmed that extra virgin olive oil contains a compound called oleocanthal, which has genuine anti-inflammatory properties. It is not a potent anti-inflammatory like ibuprofen, but on a scale of 0 to nothing, which was what the ancient world offered, olive oil was real. It worked, not as a cure, but as relief. And in a world where relief was all you could hope for, that was revolutionary. The second pillar of biblical medicine was wine, not as a drink, as an antiseptic. The alcohol present in wine, even in the diluted wine that was common at the time, had a real bactericidal effect. When the parable of the Good Samaritan describes the Samaritan treating the wounds of the man beaten on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, the text is specific. He poured oil and wine on the wounds and bandaged them. Luke 10:34. What seems like a casual narrative detail is, in fact, a medical protocol. Wine first, to clean, to disinfect, to kill at least part of the bacteria in the open wound. Oil afterward, to create a protective barrier, a layer that sealed the wound against dirt and insects. Bandaging last, to immobilize and protect, cleaning, protection, coverage. This is not folklore. This is primitive first aid. And Luke, the author of the Gospel who records this parable with more clinical detail than any other, was a physician. The text of Colossians explicitly calls Luke the beloved physician. And when a first-century doctor describes a wound treatment with this precision, it is worth paying attention. But oil and wine were the treatments for the lucky ones. For most people, what existed was a universe of folk remedies that ranged from the harmless to the terrifying. The balm of Gilead, mentioned in Jeremiah 8:22, when the prophet asks, "Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there?" was a resin extracted from a specific tree in the Jordan River region. This resin was so valued that it was exported to Egypt and Mesopotamia. Merchants sold it by weight in gold. Literally. The balm of Gilead was the most expensive medication in the ancient world, and its real effect likely didn't exceed that of a moderate topical anti-inflammatory. But the belief in its power was so absolute that possessing a vial of this balm was like having health insurance. People felt they were protected. Besides the balm, there was an entire pharmacopoeia based on plants that grew in the region. Hyssop, mentioned dozens of times in the Bible, including in Psalm 51, "Purify me with hyssop and I shall be clean," was used to treat respiratory infections and digestive problems. Myrrh, one of the gifts from the Magi to the baby Jesus, was applied as a topical analgesic on wounds and as an oral antiseptic. When Mark describes that they offered Jesus on the cross wine mixed with myrrh, this was not additional cruelty, it was mercy. Myrrh had anesthetic properties. That wine with myrrh was the ancient equivalent of a painkiller, a rudimentary attempt to ease the agony of the crucifixion. And Jesus refused it. He refused the only thing that could diminish the pain. But when the herbs and oils failed, and they failed almost always in severe cases, there remained something that makes any modern person's stomach turn: cauterization. The principle was brutal in its simplicity. If a wound was infected and spreading, you took an iron, heated it until it was glowing red, and pressed it against the raw flesh. The pain was indescribable. Patients fainted. Some died from the shock. But the hot iron did something that no herb could. It destroyed the infected tissue and cauterized the blood vessels, stopping both the infection and the bleeding. It was savage, it was primitive, and it worked. Not always, not safely, but it worked enough that it was practiced for millennia. Egyptian medical writings from the Edwin Smith Papyrus, dated 1600 BC, already described the technique in detail. When there was nothing else, there was fire. And there was something even more extreme: trepanation, opening the skull of a living person. It sounds like horror fiction, but trepanned skulls have been found in practically every culture of the ancient world, including the region of Palestine. The procedure consisted of using a stone or metal tool to scrape or drill the skull bone until an opening was created. Why? Theories vary. Some researchers believe it was done to release evil spirits, literally opening a door so that the demon causing the headache, epilepsy, or strange behavior could leave. Others argue it was a treatment for cranial fractures and brain hematomas. And in that case, it was real surgical medicine, because relieving intracranial pressure is exactly what a neurosurgeon would do today. The most impressive detail: many of these skulls show signs of healing around the opening. The patients survived. They had their skulls opened with stone tools, without anesthesia, without antibiotics, without sterilization, and they survived. The human body is more resilient than anyone imagines, but none of these techniques, neither the oil, nor the wine, nor the cauterization, nor the trepanation, addressed what was probably the greatest source of death in the biblical world: childbirth. And here we enter territory that documentaries rarely touch because it is too hard. Having a child in Bible times was the most dangerous act a woman could perform. More dangerous than any battle, any journey, any individual disease. It is estimated that between 1 in 25 and 1 in 30 women died during or shortly after childbirth. To put it in perspective, a woman who had 6 children, which was common, faced a cumulative chance of death greater than 20%. 1 in 5. Every pregnancy was a gamble. Childbirth happened at home, on the floor, usually on a mat or on stones that served as a kind of birthing stool. Exodus mentions the birth stones when Pharaoh commands the Hebrew midwives to kill the boys at birth. Midwives existed and were respected. Shiphrah and Puah, the 2 midwives who disobey Pharaoh and save the Hebrew babies, are some of the first named heroines of the Bible. But what a midwife could do was limited. If the baby was in the wrong position, if it came sideways, if the umbilical cord wrapped around the neck, if the placenta did not detach, there was no C-section, there were no forceps, there was no synthetic oxytocin to stimulate contractions. The midwife could manipulate the baby with her hands, could massage the abdomen, could use herbs to stimulate contractions, and she could pray. When none of that worked, the mother died, or the baby died, or both. Genesis 35 tells of the death of Rachel, one of the most beloved figures of the Old Testament, during the birth of Benjamin. The text says she had very difficult labor, and that the midwife tried to encourage her, saying, "Do not fear, for you will have another son." But Rachel was dying, and as she died, as life escaped her, she gave the child a name: Ben-Oni, son of my sorrow. That is the name a dying mother gave her last son with the last breath she had. Son of my sorrow. Jacob later changed the name to Benjamin, son of my right hand. But the original name, the name Rachel chose on the threshold of death, tells a truth that millions of women in the ancient world knew intimately. Giving birth could be the last thing you would ever do, and those who survived childbirth still faced what came after. Puerperal infection, childbed fever, was a silent and relentless killer. Without antibiotics, without sterile conditions, with hands and instruments that had touched dozens of other things before touching the mother, bacteria invaded the torn uterus and the bloodstream. The fever began 2 or 3 days after delivery. Violent chills, piercing abdominal pain, and in a few days, sepsis. The same woman who had survived the birth, who held her child in her arms, who thought the danger had passed. This woman began to shake, then to hallucinate, and in a week she was dead, without understanding why. Without anyone around her understanding why. The midwife had done everything right. The prayers had been said. And even so, God took the mother. At least that was how they interpreted it. Because what else could it be? And here we come to a question that is perhaps the most disturbing of all those we will address in this video. How did people deal with pain? Not emotional pain, physical pain, raw, constant, inescapable pain. Because painkillers, as a pharmacological concept, simply did not exist in the biblical world. Aspirin was invented in 1897. Morphine was isolated in 1804. Paracetamol in 1877. Throughout all of biblical history, from Abraham to the last apostle, humanity lived without any of them. What did that mean in practice? It meant that pain was a permanent companion of human existence. It meant that a toothache lasted until the tooth fell out, or until you died. It meant that a kidney stone, and yes, kidney stones have been found in Egyptian mummies, was endured minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, with nothing to diminish it. It meant that a broken bone hurt for as long as it took to heal, weeks, months, and all you could do was bite on a piece of leather and wait. Wine was the closest analgesic that existed. Proverbs 31:6 says, "Give strong drink to the one who is perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress." This is not a metaphor, it is a medical instruction. Give alcohol to those who are dying of pain. Numb them. It is the most you can do. The Talmud mentions a practice where those condemned to death received wine mixed with incense before execution, a gesture of mercy that sought to at least partially dull the agony that was to come. And the wine with myrrh offered to Jesus on the cross, as I mentioned before, followed this same logic. But the effectiveness of alcohol as a painkiller is limited. It numbs, but it does not eliminate. It reduces consciousness, but it does not take away the pain. And when the pain was too strong for wine, and in severe cases it always was, there was only endurance. And this shaped people's relationship with suffering in a way that the modern world has completely lost. Because when you cannot escape pain, you must find a meaning for it. And the meaning the biblical world found was this: pain is pedagogical, pain teaches, pain purifies, pain brings one closer to God. The book of Job is entirely built on this tension. A righteous man loses everything: children, health, dignity. His body is covered in sores. He sits in ashes and scrapes lesions with a piece of broken pottery. And the question that runs through the whole book, from the first to the last chapter, is why? If God is just, why does the righteous suffer? If disease is punishment, what did Job do? Job's friends repeat the official theology: you must have sinned, confess, repent. And Job refuses. He insists on his innocence. He insists he did nothing to deserve that. And in the end, and this is one of the most disconcerting moments in human literature, God answers. But he does not answer the question. He does not explain why Job suffered. Instead, he asks a series of questions. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Do you know where light dwells? Can you lead forth the constellations? God's answer is not an answer. It is a redefinition of the question. It is as if God were saying pain is real, suffering is real, but your capacity to understand the reason is too limited to contain the answer. And it was with this theology, this mixture of acceptance, resistance, and faith, that millions of people endured the unendurable: the woman in labor, the man with the broken leg, the child with fever, the leper outside the walls, all living in a reality where pain was not a defect in the system, it was the system, and where the only reliable resource was not an herb, nor an oil, nor a ritual. It was the hope that the same God who allowed the suffering would eventually explain it, or better yet, end it. But not all the diseases of the biblical world left marks on the skin or the bones. There existed a category of infirmity that was perhaps the most feared of all, more feared than leprosy, more feared than the plague, more feared than any fever. These were the diseases that attacked the mind. And the way the ancient world understood, diagnosed, and treated what we call today mental illness is one of the most revealing and most disturbing stories in all of the biblical narrative. Because in the biblical world, mental illness did not exist, not as a category, not as a concept. The idea that the brain is an organ that can become ill, that brain chemistry can become unbalanced, that neurotransmitters can fail, that trauma can reconfigure neural circuits, all of this is knowledge that is less than 200 years old. To the ancient world, the brain was not even recognized as the seat of thought. The Egyptians, during mummification, discarded the brain. They pulled it through the nose with a bronze hook and threw it away. The heart was preserved with reverence. The brain was trash. If the most advanced civilization of the ancient world treated the brain as a disposable organ, imagine what happened when this ignored organ began to fail. What we call schizophrenia, the biblical world called demonic possession. What we call severe depression, they called an evil spirit sent by God. What we call epilepsy, they called a demon attack. What we call bipolar disorder, they called madness. And the difference was not just in vocabulary, it was in treatment. Because if a disease is caused by bacteria, you seek a remedy. But if a disease is caused by a demon, you seek an exorcist. And if it is sent by God as punishment, you seek nothing. You repent and wait. The diagnosis determined the patient's fate, and the diagnosis was always invariably wrong. The most detailed case of mental illness in the Old Testament is that of King Saul. 1 Samuel says with disturbing clarity, "The Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him." Reread that phrase. An evil spirit from the Lord. God himself, according to the text, sent the disease. And the symptoms the text describes over the following chapters form a clinical picture that any modern psychiatrist would recognize. Sudden mood swings, outbursts of disproportionate anger, paranoia. Saul becomes convinced that David, his best warrior, his son-in-law, wants to kill him and steal his throne. Attempted homicide on at least 2 occasions. Saul hurls a spear at David while he is playing the harp. Episodes of uncontrollable crying, periods of total prostration, and a scene that is particularly revealing. In 1 Samuel 19, Saul strips off his clothes, falls to the ground, and lies naked all day and all night, prophesying. The people around ask, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" But the tone is not one of admiration. It is one of embarrassment, of horror. The king has lost control of himself. And what was the treatment? Music. 1 Samuel tells that when the evil spirit came upon Saul, David would take the harp and play. And the text says that Saul would be refreshed and be well, and the evil spirit would depart from him. This is extraordinary for 2 reasons. First, because music therapy is a recognized medical discipline today. Modern studies demonstrate that music can reduce cortisol, lower heart rate, and relieve symptoms of anxiety and depression. What David did intuitively with his harp 3,000 years ago, hospitals do today with clinical protocols. Second, because the relief was temporary. The music calmed Saul, but it did not cure him. The spirit returned. The episodes became more frequent and more violent. The disease progressed over years until it culminated the night before Saul's final battle on Mount Gilboa, when he, desperate, consults a medium, the witch of Endor, to speak with the already dead prophet Samuel. And the next day, cornered by the Philistines, wounded by archers, Saul falls on his own sword. The first king of Israel died by suicide. And the disease that led him to that point never had a name, never had a diagnosis, never had real treatment. It had only a harp and a theological explanation. But Saul is not the only case. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, the most powerful man in the world in the 6th century BC, the conqueror of Jerusalem, the destroyer of Solomon's temple, suffered what Daniel chapter 4 describes as a beastly transformation. The text says that Nebuchadnezzar was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. 7 times, probably 7 years, living like an animal, without speaking, without recognizing himself, without dressing, grazing. Modern psychiatry has a name for this: clinical lycanthropy, or more specifically, boanthropy, the delusional belief that one has been transformed into an ox or bovine animal. It is rare, but documented. A ruler at the height of absolute power, suddenly reduced to a state where he cannot distinguish himself from a grazing animal. And for 7 years, no one could do anything. There was nothing to do. In the New Testament, the Gospels are full of encounters with people suffering from conditions that mix the physical and the mental in ways that defy simple categories. The most dramatic case is that of the Gerasene demoniac, narrated in Mark 5. A man who lived among the tombs, who could not be restrained even with chains because he would break them, who cried out day and night, who cut himself with stones, who was naked, who was so violent that no one dared pass by that way. When Jesus asks the spirit's name, the answer is, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And Jesus casts the demons into a herd of pigs that rushes down a steep bank and drowns in the sea. 2,000 pigs. That is the number Mark records. And afterward, and this is the part that always impresses me, the people of the city come and find the man sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. Sitting, clothed, in his right mind. 3 words that describe everything that man was not before. And instead of celebrating, what do the people of the city do? They ask Jesus to leave. They are afraid, because it is one thing to live with a madman among the tombs that they already knew. It is another thing to see the inexplicable happen before their eyes. But for every Gerasene demoniac who found Jesus, there were thousands who never found anyone. And the fate of these people was of a cruelty that is hard to process. Whoever suffered from mental illness in the ancient world was, at best, tolerated by the family. In most cases, they were chained, literally. The fact that the Gerasene broke chains indicates that chaining the mentally ill was common practice, so common that the detail is mentioned casually as something the reader would already understand. Families who could keep their sick at home did so, but in locked rooms, in basements, in stables along with the animals. Families who could not or would not simply drove them out. And these sick people became the inhabitants of the tombs, the deserts, the outskirts of cities. They lived on scraps. They were stoned by children. They died of hunger, of cold, of thirst, or in violent confrontations with people who were afraid of them. No one treated them because there was no treatment. No one welcomed them because they were considered unclean, cursed, inhabited by demonic forces. Mental illness did not just steal the person's mind, it stole their humanity in the eyes of everyone around them. And there existed another type of mental suffering that the biblical world knew well, but rarely named. what we call trauma. Soldiers who returned from battles and never slept in peace again. Women captured in wars who had seen their families massacred before their eyes. Children who grew up in besieged cities where hunger reached the point of mothers eating their own children. And yes, that is described in 2 Kings 6:28-29 and in Lamentations 4:10, with a frankness that chills the blood. What happened inside the minds of these people afterward? The ancient world had no words to describe what we call post-traumatic stress. It had no therapy. It had no follow-up. It had only silence and the Psalms. The Psalms are, in many senses, the most honest record of psychological suffering from the ancient world. When Psalm 88 says, "My soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol. I'm counted among those who go down to the pit. I'm a man who has no strength. I am set apart among the dead. You have put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions dark and deep." This is not decorative poetry. This is the cry of someone living through what we would diagnose as severe depression. And Psalm 88 is the only psalm that does not end with hope. There is no turn at the end. There is no "but I trust in God." The last line is, "Darkness is my closest friend." It is the only psalm that ends in the dark. And perhaps it exists exactly for that, so that whoever was in the dark would know they were not the first, that even the sacred book had space for despair without an answer. But we need to talk about a group that carried perhaps the heaviest burden of all in the biblical world, the children. Because if being an adult and getting sick at that time was an unpredictable sentence, being a child was living in a minefield from the first breath. Infant mortality in the ancient world is a number that needs to be said out loud to be truly understood. Between 30 and 50% of all children born did not reach 5 years of age. Half. 1 in every 2 children born in a village in Galilee, in a house in Jerusalem, in a tent in the Judean desert, died before learning to speak in full sentences. Dysentery, fever, dehydration, respiratory infections, intestinal parasites, measles, malaria. Any of these diseases, which today we treat with oral rehydration, antibiotics or vaccines, was a summary execution in the ancient world. And diarrhea, a condition the modern world treats as an inconvenience, was probably the greatest killer of children in antiquity. A 6-month-old baby with severe diarrhea loses fluids at a rate that the tiny body cannot replenish, without saline, without IVs, without oral rehydration. The mother watched her child becoming lethargic, stopping crying, the eyes sinking, the skin losing elasticity, the fontanelle sinking at the top of the skull. And she could do nothing but hold him. Hold him, breastfeed if she still could, and pray. The second book of Samuel, chapter 12, narrates what is perhaps the most painful scene of infant death in all the Bible. King David's son falls ill, and David, the warrior, the poet, the king, the man after God's own heart, lies on the ground and refuses to eat for 7 days. The elders try to lift him up. He refuses. He fasts, prostrates himself, pleads with God for the life of the child. And on the 7th day, the child dies. And the servants are afraid to tell David, because they think, if he was like this while the child was alive, what will he do when he knows he has died? David's reaction upon learning of the death is one of the most theologically dense passages of the Old Testament. He gets up, he washes his face, he changes his clothes, he eats. And when the servants ask, perplexed, "What is this? While the child lived, you fasted and wept. Now that he has died, you get up and eat?" David answers, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I thought, who knows? Perhaps the Lord will be gracious to me and the child may live. But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. I shall go to him, he will not return to me. That phrase contains the entire theology of infant death in the ancient world, condensed into 10 words: the brutal acceptance, the wounded but not destroyed faith, and the resignation of one who knows that this pain, this mourning, this loss, is the price of being alive in a world where children die and no one can prevent it. And the children who survived the first years still face dangers that the modern world has eliminated so completely that we forget they existed. Intestinal worms. Practically every child in the ancient world carried parasites. Ascaris, tapeworms, hookworms. They lived in the intestine, stole nutrients, caused anemia, abdominal distension, chronic pain. Archaeological studies of ancient latrines in Jerusalem, yes, archaeologists analyzed latrines, found eggs of at least 4 different species of intestinal parasites. These worms were so universal that they probably weren't even considered a disease. They were part of life. Every child had a swollen belly. Every child was too thin. Every child had something living inside them, and no one knew. No one even suspected that microscopic creatures could exist inside the human body, stealing the food the child so badly needed. And there were the epidemics, the plagues, the mass death events that swept through entire cities and which the biblical world interpreted invariably as the hand of God in judgment. The 10th plague of Egypt, the death of all the firstborn, is the best known example, but it is far from the only one. In 2 Samuel 24, after David conducts a census that displeases God, a pestilence strikes Israel and kills 70,000 people in 3 days. 70,000. The text does not specify the disease. It could have been bubonic plague, cholera, typhus, any infection capable of spreading rapidly in concentrated populations without sanitation, without organized quarantine, without an understanding of contagion. And the explanation in the text is direct. God sent a destroying angel. The angel stretched out his hand over Jerusalem to destroy it, and God said, "It is enough." And the angel stopped. The epidemic ceased, not because of any medical measure, not because of quarantine or treatment, but because God decided it was sufficient. That was the mental model. Disease comes from God, healing comes from God. The human being in the middle only waits and obeys. But here something fascinating arises, because despite this theology of acceptance, despite the belief that disease was divine will, the biblical text contains something that no other religious text of the ancient world contains with the same clarity: public health rules. And these rules, when you examine them with modern eyes, are surprisingly, almost inexplicably, effective. Leviticus 13 and 14 establish a quarantine protocol for skin diseases that any modern epidemiologist would recognize as sophisticated. The person suspected of having a contagious disease was examined by the priest. If the case was ambiguous, the person was isolated for 7 days. After 7 days, they were examined again. If the condition had not spread, they were isolated for another 7 days. 14 days of isolation under observation, 14 days. When the entire world faced COVID-19 in 2020, what was the quarantine protocol recommended by the World Health Organization? 14 days. 3,400 years later, the most advanced science on the planet reached the same number that Moses wrote on a scroll in the Sinai desert. And it didn't stop at quarantine. Leviticus 11 prohibited the consumption of pork and shellfish without scales, exactly the foods with the highest risk of transmitting parasites and toxins in hot climates without refrigeration. Deuteronomy 23:12-13 commanded that excrement be buried outside the camp with a shovel, basic sanitation in a world where most peoples defecated where they slept. Leviticus 15 required washing with running water after contact with bodily fluids, in a world where Greek and Roman doctors operated with dirty hands and didn't even consider that this could be a problem. Numbers 19 established a purification period of 7 days for anyone who touched a corpse, 7 days away from others, 7 days for any infection transmitted by the dead body to manifest before the person returned to the community. None of these rules were explained in medical terms. None mentioned bacteria, viruses, or contamination. The language was always religious, clean and unclean, sacred and profane, acceptable and abominable. The people who followed these rules did not know why they worked. They followed them because God commanded, but they worked. The survival rate from epidemics among populations that followed the Levitical laws was consistently higher than among neighboring peoples. Israel's own enemies noticed this, and during the Black Death of the 14th century, 2,000 years after Leviticus was written, Jewish communities in Europe had significantly lower mortality rates than the surrounding populations. Not because they were immune, but because they still washed their hands, they still buried their dead quickly, they still isolated the sick, they still followed rules written in an era when no one on the planet knew what a microorganism was. And it is here that this entire story, this 1-hour journey through a world of pain, fear, despair, and faith, reaches the point that truly matters. Because we live on the other side. We live in the world those people could never imagine. A world where childhood diarrhea is treated with a packet of salts that costs cents, where leprosy is cured with a pill, where blindness from cataracts is resolved with a 20-minute surgery, where the pain of childbirth can be eliminated with an injection in the spine, where an epileptic seizure is not demonic possession, it is an anomalous electrical discharge in the cerebral cortex, controllable with daily medication. But here is what disturbs me. The distance between their world and ours is not as great as we would like to believe. There are today, at this moment, regions of the planet where conditions are almost identical to those of first-century Palestine. Communities without access to antibiotics, villages without potable water, entire populations where infant mortality still approaches 30%, places where a child with diarrhea still dies in the mother's arms exactly as they died 2,000 years ago, not because the cure does not exist, but because it has not reached them. The difference between the biblical world and the modern world is not just one of knowledge, it is one of distribution. We know how to cure. We simply do not cure everyone, and perhaps that is the most uncomfortable lesson that emerges from everything we have seen in this video. The biblical world suffered because it did not know. It did not know what caused disease. It did not know how to stop contagion. It did not know that dirty water killed, that dirty hands transmitted, that worms stole, that the brain became ill. And in that ignorance, it invented the explanations it could. Demons, divine punishment, ritual uncleanness, wrong explanations, but which in many cases generated accidentally correct behaviors. Wash, isolate, separate, bury. It wasn't science, but it saved lives. We, on the other hand, know. We know everything. We have microscopes that see viruses. We have vaccines that eradicated smallpox, the same smallpox that killed pharaohs. We have surgeons who transplant hearts. We have antibiotics that would have seemed like a miracle to any priest of the temple in Jerusalem. And even so, even with all this, there are still children dying of diseases that cost cents to treat. There are still people being chained for mental illness in communities where exorcism is the only treatment available. There are still mothers holding children in their arms, with nothing to offer but their own bodies and a prayer. The biblical world had no choice. We do. And that choice, what we do with the knowledge we have, whom we reach, whom we leave behind, is perhaps the most biblical question there is. Because in the end, the story of disease in the Bible is not just a story about primitive medicine. It is a story about what it means to be human in a fragile body, in an indifferent world, with eternity whispering in the ear. Every leper who cried unclean on the roads of Judea, every mother who buried a child before dawn, every king who went mad on his throne, every child with a belly swollen with worms they would never know existed, all carried the same question that we still carry every time a diagnosis falls like a sentence, every time the pain doesn't go away, every time the body reminds us that we are mortal. The question hasn't changed in 3,000 years. Only the answers have changed. And if this video made you look at the ancient world with different eyes, click on the next video appearing on your screen now. It was made especially for those who made it this far.